Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We welcome you again on Radio Ramadan and iSyllabus Facebook live stream. I am your host, Zubair Akram, with my guest, Sh Ruzwan Mohammed. Um, I'm actually sad to say that it is Lahore and Glasgow, not Istanbul anymore. But yes, Islamicate conversations with Sheikh Ruzwan Mohammed. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How you doing?
Alhamdulillah. Well, I used to brag about this. It's Lahore and then Istanbul, and the people in Glasgow are listening. But but all good things come to end, as they say. How different did you find Glasgow coming back from Istanbul?
Well, that's undisclosed information at this moment in time. I don't think anyone apart from my family know that I'm back in Glasgow. But alhamdulillah, I've been. Well, yes, we are back in Glasgow, back in my library, and it's an interesting trip. Obviously, you enjoy your time in one place, but you never know where the best place for you is. I think that's the most important kind of thing I've realized in my life is that. People going through different experiences sometimes feel that those tests and tribulations are difficult, but sometimes they end up being very beneficial long term. In fact, they create a degree of, you would say, strength. You would discover strength from those types of experiences. And everybody during the last 18 months, I think, has been going through. Very difficult kind of experiences, new experiences for themselves, and that includes myself, probably includes yourself as well. And from that perspective, just traveling, I mean, coming back to the UK from Turkey, obviously, if you know the UK context, is on the red list for the UK, which means that you cannot travel directly unless you actually are in quarantine in a hotel for a period of time, which meant that we had to travel somewhere else. We had to go to Bulgaria. Bulgaria is a country of about 8 million, I would say, people. It borders Turkey, and I've been to Bulgaria before. I've been to Greece before, and I remember in the mid 90s, I went to Greece in the Thrace region of Greece, which is bordering against Turkey. Lots of Turks there. I mean, certain cities have over 50% population Turkish. I stayed there for a period of time, and at that point, I was saddened. I was actually, I wouldn't say traumatized, but there was a degree of deep sadness at the situation of the Muslims in those countries, because you could see the oppressive nature of the Greek state against them. You could see that they were almost humbling themselves in front of the authorities. The government was putting in place very draconian policies against the Greek, previously Turkish population, despite the fact that they spoke Turkish and they, had all the trappings of their Turkish heritage. When I went to Bulgaria, I found it exactly the same in 2021, just like last week. I actually spoke to one of the imams, of the two main mosques, the old historical mosques in what was Plovdiv. Plovdiv is the old cultural capital and the Ottoman capital of Bulgaria. Had amazing architecture. Had a mosque there from before the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. And the imam was saying that they've just purchased a mosque, a historical mosque from a restaurant, which was actually using the mosque as a restaurant, but they had, pictures of wine, pictures of pigs, pictures of all sorts of things. They painted over this historical mosque, and obviously it's an Italian Italian restaurant, very famous, but they had no idea that it was a historical place of worship, and they'd only just purchased it, and so it got me thinking about the fact that Europe, has a very strange relationship with Islam, especially around the borders of where Islam touches into the European consciousness, which is Bulgaria, Greece, Romania. You've got Czechoslovakia, you've got Bosnia, And obviously the Bosnian, this was this last month, the anniversary of the massacre of
Yes.
the people of Srebrenica. Um,
Treblis.
yeah, it brings home something very important, which is these are not we're not talking about historical ancient events that took place. We're talking about things that people can tell you about right now. Um, and so in traveling, fasiru fil ard, the Quran very clearly says, and then traverse into the earth. فانظروا كيف كان عاقبة الذين من قبلكم, and look at the fate of the people that were before you. And so when I was in Plovdiv, you see, in fact, Ablaki Murad, Cambridge University, he has a very interesting article from a long time ago, I think, about Plovdiv, in which he compares it and actually titles it the Granada of the East. Granada. Granada in Spain. In Granada, you can go, it's the last, it's the last citadel of Islam. After this amazing fruition and growth of Islam in Muslim Spain, all of a sudden, how many tears can we shed for Granada? Granada was lost. And all you now have is these amazing monuments such as the Alhambra. And Plovdiv was very similar. The old city is very similar. And what's even more striking about it is that it preserves mosques, it preserves ancient churches, it preserves ancient synagogues as they were at a time when Europe was in the medieval ages, the Middle Ages, the medieval ages. And now, if you look at Plovdiv, one of the most depressing things that I've experienced over the last decade, I think probably, is just the coach journey into Plovdiv itself. Now, if you imagine in your mind the worst nightmare you can have of the Soviet era deprivation. Think of Chernobyl. Think of the city itself. Think of the devastation. It's almost as if you're going into a city which casinos, and you have people sitting on the street drinking and smoking, just idling around. The buildings are dilapidated, Soviet era, mass housing. And I was thinking, is this Plovdiv? Is this this beautiful place that everyone tells me about? And what you find is that everything up until the old city is like that. Modern. It's the modern world. It's the kind of it's Orwellian in nature in terms of the striking starkness and coldness and poverty and deprivation. And I would say soullessness. There's no soul there. And this is what modern society essentially is bringing to us. And then all of a sudden, and the second day when we kind of got our bearings, we went to the old city, and it was amazing. I mean, it was, I think, 2019. It was the European City of Culture, because of the Ottoman part of the city, and so you go through life and you see things like that, and you think, and in fact, what was it? Who was it that wrote? What did the world lose from the fall of Islam? It was Abu Hassan Nadawi. He wrote a book.
Yeah, the saviors of Islamic spirit.
No, he wrote that, but he also wrote a book, What Did the World Lose by the Demise of Islam, which is a fantastic book, because essentially, if you think about it, that book, I'm absolutely sure it's him. He and it's in Arabic. I don't know if it's in English, actually. I don't know if it's in English, but it is in Arabic, so I read it in Arabic.
Okay.
Yeah, the title in Arabic is ماذا خسر العالم بانحطاط الإسلام. What did the world lose with the fall of Islam? And so when you travel, you realize exactly what that is. Civilization, culture, tolerance, enlightenment, knowledge. Despite what people say about knowledge and progress, I think those words of Abu Hassan Nadawi and that observation is very, very true. And you see it in those kind of situations. And listeners could say, well, this is a very pessimistic, one-sided view of history. But if you go away from the outskirts, which border Turkey, go to the center of the cradle of democracy and egalitarian values, which is France, or you go to the European Court of Human Rights, which just has made it perfectly valid and legal for companies to ban women from wearing headscarves, not veils, headscarves. It's the hijab. And you go to France, which is basically deciding who the imam of the mosque will be and what they can say and what they cannot say, and whether they can quote a verse of Quran and whether they cannot. Leave aside Romania, leave aside Bulgaria, leave aside Greece and their draconian clamp down against Islam for the last 30, 40 years. Go to the center of European civilization and the most enlightened countries and look at what they're doing. And it for me, it creates a very, very bleak, sinister picture of what Europe essentially becomes when it realizes that it cannot just manifest itself by being nice. It has to flex its muscle, and its muscle is a legal muscle. And so it was a depressing time. I mean, it was a very depressing time. When you go to Granada, you see the beauty. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But
So
the pain.
I was so we were. It so happens on Thursdays probably for the last maybe many weeks I've been traveling. So today I did about 400 kilometers out of Lahore. I went to a place called Vihari. Vihari is near. So Multan. Multan is city of Aulia, as it says, as it goes, and then from Multan is another hour. And I was slightly kind of disappointed. This was my first time. I know a few people who live in Glasgow. They're from that town. So one of our contacts, or one of my kind of acquaintances, his niece passed away at a very young age in Manchester in a road accident. So I went there for Fatiha. So disappointment in a way that brand new roads, but what Mughals left is quite different from what you are saying about Ottoman ghost that exists in Central Asia, in Europe. So I'm coming to this understanding that, okay, Mughals left a lot of rich architecture in big cities, likes of Delhi, Agra, Lahore, Jhelum, all these places, Rawalpindi even, Peshawar, some of real marvels. But then when you go to the country, there isn't anything that you could say that Muslim civilization existed here for so many hundreds of years, actually over 1,000 years. It is land, okay, cultivation, fine, but that's about it. There isn't that Sabil, there isn't that Sarai, other than GT Road, which is Sher Shah Suri. So Grand Trunk Road, all the way from Kabul to Calcutta, and that has this welfare that was embodied in Muslim culture. That you every so many miles there is a resting place. Every so many miles there is water. Every so many miles there is a mosque, and there is a milestone. But that one road, and that's it. Architecture exists in big cities, and architecture exists in form of huge, massive mosques and forts and fortresses and palaces. But for a common man, there isn't anything other than agriculture, poverty. So there is this difference that I find in when you go around like Turkish, Ottoman places, likes of Bulgaria, Romania, where basically you describe as the ghost that exists, Ottoman empires. So there is this difference. I'm wondering why that is. What inspired these Ottomans and what inspired these Mughals is probably two different things. I don't know. What was your experience around that?
No, I think you have to. I mean, tangible things that exist are architecture, art, artifacts. They don't necessarily. I don't believe they necessarily indicate the developed nature of a society. I mean, you could make the case that the more grand the architecture and public buildings, the more oppressive the state. Because I was reading an article from two researchers from Oslo University, and they were researching the correlation between two very interesting things: the size of skyscrapers built over the last 20 years and the authoritarian nature of the states that built them. Okay. In other words, you look at the degree of oppressiveness, tyranny that exists generally based on most markers that people would use, and the size of skyscrapers. And guess
So,
what the
so, so
correlation was?
yeah.
Guess
So
what
the
the correlation?
grandeur is reflective of oppression because it is there to impress and to say, look, we are here and we are powerful.
No. I mean, it's to do with the fact that you usurp wealth and you put it into futile, endeavors. Essentially, in the past, that was the case. But not in all cases, but I'll come to that in a minute. But the point is that just grand buildings that take your breath away is not the mark of a civilized society. It could be the marker of a degenerate society. If you think of historically Nimrod and Fir'aun and all these kind of people, they built monuments for themselves based on killing and trampling of the bloods of slaves. And so what's more important is the historical documents that we have through researching on things like you were talking about, Sabil or caravanserais or places to rest and places where poor people could, hospitals and hospices and shelters for people that were frail. In that sense, I think you're looking at the fact that Islam, in the context of waqf, so look at Egypt, for example, not necessarily an Ottoman part of the Ottoman Empire from its early period. 80% of its land was owned by awqaf, which were charitable trusts. I mean, right away, that means whatever that charitable trust was, it meant that was being given back to people to help them. And so, it was land, it was this land, but the land was used to grow and then to give back to people that needed it. And so that concept didn't exist in Europe. If you look at it, those kind of endowments started to appear in Europe in the 19th century. When you had industrialists, you had, and you would say, be clear about it, slave traders, tobacco merchants in Scotland, for example, who used their wealth then to build libraries, like the Mitchell Library in Glasgow, for example. All these monuments were created in the back of quite oppressive economic systems, which made these people very, very rich. The Carnegie Institute, for example, Rockefeller, all these institutions were built on, very dubious forms of economy. And then, in the 19th, 20th century, they started to build these massive monuments and endowments that we still benefit from today. But in Islam, for example, in the Ottoman Empire, and this is something that's very practical and useful for us, is that they created small-scale endowments that helped people in small-scale niche issues, such as caring for cats or something. They were very, very niche. They were for very specific people. So there'd be awqaf, for example, the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. All that area was actually awqaf for people from a specific part of Morocco who could come and stay there. All that land was demolished. All the houses were demolished. All the land that belonged to awqaf. I mean, I've got a book on this, on the awqaf of Jerusalem. That was decimated by the Zionist state. And we have land documents for every single thing, every single inch of that land. It was endowed to Moroccans who came to visit the Holy Lands. Now, international law says that belongs to people who had the last land deeds, but for the international law is not important here because we have an apartheid state. But what's interesting is the degree of specificity, the degree of focus within which awqaf were. They weren't massive buildings. They were just places that people came in, ate, and slept. And so I'd be wary of saying, we don't see these amazing buildings. Good. The Prophet ﷺ, his society and the culture and the civilization he built never left any, think about it. Was there any kind of cups, saucers, glass, metalwork, coins, anything? Nothing. The coins that were used at the time of the Prophet ﷺ were minted by the Persians and the Romans, Byzantine Empire. They didn't feel, it was only during the time of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anh that they started to mint Islamic coins, and during the time of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan that they started to create buildings like the Dome of the Rock. And so, a Muslim could make the case that, the less things we see about our history, shows us that people are much more equal and much more, I think, equitable. Does that make sense? Because to create something massive, you have to actually plunder in some way from somebody else.
Is it always the case?
No, not always the case. But I'm saying if society is just all these massive monuments or statues, then essentially what you're doing is there's a degree of oppression underlying that monument, that building, that institution.
Yeah.
Awqaf, which endowments, Islamic endowments, were the complete opposite. Were just a piece of land, an orchard, the trees, figs. We have orchards in Palestine that were awqaf that still live, predate the time of the Prophet Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, that were bought by Muslims and established as awqaf in Hebron, for example, in Ariha, which is what's it called in English? Ariha is Jericho.
Retreats.
Jericho. So all these are ancient cities, ancient towns mentioned in the Bible that Muslims made awqaf. And unfortunately now what do we have? Every single inch is owned by a multinational or an organization, or even, we're hearing about, all this in the news about, but it's not in the news anymore, Sheikh Jarrah, which was part of an endowment belonging to Muslims in Jerusalem. All of that has just been usurped. And so I think we should be very careful in terms of what we're building as Muslims and what we view as being, mashallah, we're really developed and we're reaching other civilizations. There's nothing better than husn al-khuluq for population and also for leaders. For an individual and also the leaders of a nation, there's nothing better that marks a good leader than husn al-khuluq. And then taking advice.
But okay, so that's soft, as I call it, soft skills or soft kind of. This is manifestation of faith in a way. So I was reading Maulana Abul Kalam Azad's article on, say, Yajuj Majuj, and he starts giving examples of, is akhlaq part of religion or is it out with religion? So you don't have to be religious to be holding akhlaq. So these are two separate things. Anyway, I'm going to get distracted here. Actually, there was something else we're going to ask you, which is this, right? Yeah. So there are two dimensions of a human life. One is your relationship with your creator for yourself, your spiritual being, and one is the relationship with people. And your endeavor is to add value to human life with people. When you're interacting with people, your entire life, if you're living a life with purpose, is you adding value to yourself and to people around you and whoever you're with. Now, for that, you need to be resourceful. You need to hold resources. And sometimes I feel what comes out of religious teaching, the way it is kind of manifested, is a simple life which leaves less resources to your at your disposal. And even this conversation, like not having grand buildings, meaning you can only have grand buildings once you're resourceful. If you are in possession of resources which are access to your needs, either families, individuals, or state, and then you create this art and culture which shows that you've got a stamp that you put a stamp on, and then it marks your era. Is it something would you say it is discouraged, it's not needed? And if it is there, if Muslim minds, thinking minds, if they are building civilization, they would not dream of building these centers, the heartlands, likes of Istanbul, likes of Cairo, likes of Lahore, likes of Bukhara, Samarkand. If you go into Central Asia, Your civilization is defined by the type of buildings you have left there.
No, I
Are we
think that's
saying?
no. We're not saying. I know what you're saying. You're saying that should we aim not to do those kind of things. I think that's not the point. The Prophet ﷺ lived in a town which was probably 10,000 people. The requirements in terms of infrastructure, street, patterns and marketplaces was very well known for that size. But despite that, think what the Prophet did when he arrived in Medina Munawwara. The first thing he did was establish a mosque. The second thing he did was establish a marketplace. These are structural builds. So the mosque was not just for worship; it was for congregating and meeting. And the second thing he did was a marketplace, which is right next to Jantul Baqi' now, which was essentially over 1 kilometer long and I think half a kilometer wide. If you think of that, that's far too big for that type of city. But what did he do? He wanted to create the space which would allow people to come in as it expanded. And so he was putting in place the way, the means by which the kind of, I would say resourcefulness and the kind of prosperity of the city would be assured. And so he started to put in place things that created civilization. And so it's up to people. If you earn the money, you can spend the money. Simple as that. And if you have excess, you give it in charity, in zakat, at the end of the year. And so the Prophet ﷺ, in that context, acted in a way that was relevant to the society within which he was living, ﷺ. And so when you arrive and say, for example, you come to a city and in the past, they presented Islam to a city. People were told, well, you can't tell people about Islam. And the thing was, you can't stop people from hearing about the message. And so the Muslims used to say, look, allow us to preach or we go to war. And usually it was either they were allowed to preach or they went to war. And if they captured the city, imagine they captured Fustat in Egypt, or they captured Istanbul, for example. What do you do with that massive building, which is Hagia Sophia? What do you do with the architecture, the structures, the what people are used to in terms of, culture and urf? Urf is just like the custom they have of dealing with things in government. Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu accepted and incorporated all the culture, all of the kind of structures that people had in place in societies and civilizations that he came into, such as Quds. Quds was conquered, just at the time of the passing of Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. It was granted to Umar radiallahu anhu in terms of the key being given to him. And when he arrived, he didn't decimate and dismantle the structures and the street architecture and all the rest of it. He kept it. And he said, okay, what can we do to rectify anything that is not, correct? And these are just small things. I mean, what would you do? He would probably, if it was an aqueduct, or there was a channel bringing water into the city, or there was drainage that was damaging something, he would stop that. But otherwise, he would leave it and beautify it. And so there's nothing wrong with, for a massive civilizational center such as Istanbul, such as Sham, for example, which Muslims also conquered around the same time, Damascus, to keep, embellish and build upon what's there. And that is part and parcel of what's mubah. It's just permissible. It's not obligatory, but if it facilitates, I mean, this is the thing now, if by developing and creating structures and buildings, you facilitate the presentation of your faith and the presentation of your civilization as a counterculture to other civilizations, then absolutely build the most amazing monuments. And for example, in Istanbul, they've just built one of the biggest mosques in Asia, in Istanbul itself, in Çamlıca, which is a massive mosque, kind of mirroring all the other mosques, famous imperial mosque of the city. And that's brand new. That's like 3 years old, 4 years old. And so that's to create a mark. That's to create almost broadcast to the world that this is a culture that vies with other cultures and can do the architecture, the kind of technology, the art, the literature that other civilizations can do, and they can remain true to their faith at the same time. That's an advertisement for Islam. That is an advertisement for the validity of our faith. That is actually deeper than that. It's an argument for the validity of a a religious society, a religiously informed society, in an age when every single nation on the face of this earth is turning their back on faith, including the heartlands of Islam, such as, Saudi Arabia. If you look at it in terms of the slow, it's not slow actually, it's a rapid move into secularization, I think.
Yeah.
And so you do need, for just a young person, if you're a Muslim and you're looking at the world and you see a strong Muslim country which is open and civilized and clean and progressive, it gives you pride in your faith. I think that's very, very important to kind of promote.
Sheikh, see this. Moving on from this to the COVID situation just now. So countries like India and the 24 countries, they've gone into amber. Others are still red, and there is no correlation in the number of cases or the way they are to why there is restricted movement from one country to another. Do you personally, have you analyzed it? Do you see there are political motives around this, or is it something? Is it something which is we need to concern ourselves with this as Muslims, people who want to live by faith and who want to be just in even commenting of what goes around?
Okay, so I'm not an expert in contagious diseases. Neither am I specifically aware of the way that civil servants create and draft recommendations for governments, although I've an informed reading of it. But what's interesting is, when I went to Bulgaria, I actually downloaded, 2 days before I went to Bulgaria, I downloaded the documentation that explains how Bulgaria decides which country is for them red, amber, or green. Okay, so I went through that, and then I looked at the British criteria and the specific way that you can tell that you can almost like you can predict it. In fact, you can call it before it happens. It's a game of Russian roulette. Is the closest thing I can think of in terms of the UK for such a civilized country, a country which has a massive civil service that has experts, on all areas of human endeavor. If you look at I can send you it. The Bulgarian document tells you 4 or 5 criteria based upon which a country will move into green, amber, or red, based upon vaccination numbers, based upon different strands of COVID, based upon the efficacy of vaccinations that were delivered, based upon the percentage of people that have it in a country, and the rise. All these things are taken into account. So the point that you can actually say, okay, I understand exactly why that country is, because it's complete transparent. It's based upon the World Health Organization's own criteria itself. And for the UK, I mean, this is very controversial, but no, it's not very controversial. It's well known that India was delayed in its being placed upon the red list, not for any clinical reasons, and this is not I'm not saying that this is based upon trade. It's based upon subjective. Almost you get to the point of it. It's the fact that somebody went to school with somebody else and give somebody a call and said, "Please don't." Do you understand? Like Brexit has a lot to do with this, and that means a lot of people died because of that, and that also means that people in power were responsible for deaths, which is manslaughter. But it also means that people in the UK essentially are, I would say, so passive and so oblivious to the fact that they have any power at all that they don't really care. I mean, I don't think people care. The most they will say is an MP will bring it up in the House of Commons and everything will go on as it has. And that for me is shocking, because Amr ibn As radiyallahu anhu, it's a hadith in Sahih Bukhari, and he mentioned the hadith of Prophet ﷺ that a companion mentioned at the end of times the Romans, which the Europeans would be in the ascendancy. And Amr ibn As said, did the Prophet say that? And the companion said yes. And he says, if he said it, then it's true, because they have certain traits that make them honored. And one of them was that they did not they did not accept oppression from the rulers.
Hmm.
You know, and now we're getting to the point. I just think in history we're getting to this point where people have become so passive and so submissive and so sheepish and so lacking in prerogative, their own prerogative to act, that they don't really care. I mean, they could be oppressed till the cows come home and they wouldn't really care, because there's been a shift. There's been a massive shift in the way that people view power. And people think, look at the numbers of people that vote in elections.
Hmm.
And this is fascinating, because if you look at how many people voted for Boris Johnson, and you look at the number of people, for example, in Turkey, the number of people that voted in percentage terms for the present president of Turkey, and there was a number of people in the country, percentage-wise, that could have voted, that voted, there's no comparison in terms of democracy. But what do we hear in the European newspapers and news agencies? That, oh, we're so democratic, we're so representative, we're so civilized, we're so liberal. And then, okay, why? Because we elect people based upon 17% of the vote. And then if a country comes and has people voting over 54% in transparent elections, oh my goodness, this is dictatorship, and we have to bring down that government. Like Biden, he had openly invited all these people to, before he became a president, to bring down the Turkish government, which was democratically elected. Based on what? So I think that COVID has brought into focus a lot of hypocrisies within societies in the West. And for me, it underlines that there is essentially a very deep problem that Europe has with Islam, which is deep and psychological, and almost requires the whole of Europe as a collective to go onto the coach of a psychoanalyst, because there's no rationale for it at all, apart from the fact that...
Is it really that complex? I'm just thinking, is it a case of a handful can sit down and talk through the grievances and say, what's your problem? What is it? Why can't people who are in power understand? Or is it lack of understanding, miscommunication, or it is just part of divine plan that humans are the way they are, and they'll always be perpetually in this state of competition, of war, of not even understanding where the other side is coming from. If someone believes in something which they are crying out loud that, look, it is for human improvement, the life improves if you did this. If I was reading, there was a clip going viral this morning of two American women talking to each other, that the law of the Maliki fiqh, Lafif, is it the word? It was the person who introduced the law, the Maliki school of thought that became the basis of lots of legal systems around the world, and also the Shafi fiqh that became the basis. So these complexities of life dealt with by legal systems coded by Muslim jurists, and then, as we know, followed by other civilizations. What is it, from your understanding, that stops people sitting on the table and sorting out these differences?
What do you think? I'll give you a guess.
You tell me. And that's leading. No, that's leading on to something else. What I'm today we were
No.
traveling.
No. What do you think? I mean, you're saying, well, what stops people? The thing that stops people is wealth, resources. At the end of the day, you have to feed your nation. You have to feed them rubbish, and you have to amass weaponry that can demolish your enemy. And so, in a cloud cuckoo land where John Lennon is singing, Imagine, that doesn't exist. So the big, the big irony of John Lennon is that he sang a song that could never happen, and so he actually
Mm.
added to the problem of the world by singing the song.
Mm.
Why imagine? Why don't you just do something? For goodness sake. I mean, the whole point of Islam is that it didn't imagine, it did it. And John Lennon just sat there smoking weed and guitaring off into these amazing songs that now even Muslims say, imagine, Islam. Why wasn't Islam more like John Lennon? I mean, for goodness sake, wake up. I mean, his kind of, amnesia to the oppression that was happening led to all this madness that's going on now. I mean, you either act or you do, or you get out of the way. I mean, this is the thing. You did just sit there and just dream about something better. And so the reason why people don't sit around and talk about it is at the end of the day, there's corporations, there's governments, there's vested interests that require wealth, and they require it to be plundered. And the moment that they realize that a certain country has oil, it has now rare metals, it has resources, it has lithium for,
Mm.
and all these batteries are required for electric cars, they'll go to war if they're not able to get trade agreements that are so vested in their own interests. They will go to war for that. And that's why they won't sit around. And that's why they will throw aside, Goethe or Nietzsche or Rilke, all these people that spoke about Islam as being, the savior of the West. They will say, no, it's the enemy of the West, and it's regressive, and it's aggressive, and it's violent, and it's all this is being thrown out for a very specific reason, which is exactly for a specific group of people that want the war footing to remain against other nations.
And
Global
is it always
South.
going to be so? Is it always going to be just a dialogue and making people understand just through writing a book, just through being behind a mic?
No, it's not going to be. That's the whole point. I mean, it cannot be. It cannot just be, dialoguing, because this is a big myth, I think, nowadays, that people say, if only we could speak and dialogue, and this is the irony, I think, of the Israeli Arab conflict, is that there's a whole industry there saying, oh, the Jews and the Arabs just need to speak and sit, have tea.
Mm.
And I think that is such a slap in the face of just normative legal understandings of what oppression is, what usurping land is, what ownership is. Because you don't do that. If somebody steals, you don't sit and say, okay, let's talk about it. Let's make a lovely, heartwarming video about how we have the same blood, and we eat the same food, and we break the same bread, and we have the same hummus. No, you right the wrongs of what you've done, and later on we'll drink tea. Later on we'll sit down and we'll discuss, and we'll reminisce over what happened. You don't enslave a people in the largest open prison in the world, and then talk about creating one unified response to oppression if you're just all you're doing is exacerbating it. And so at a certain point, discussions and dialogue is essentially a smokescreen for massive or corporations and vested interests to continue doing what they're doing. And while you're talking and getting to know somebody who's apparently your enemy when they're not, everything is done. Before you know it, you can't even move from one country to another. You can't purchase anything. You cannot eat. You cannot do anything. And that is what's shocking about the current, civilization within which we live. It is becoming increasingly oppressive in the way that it actually decides for people what they need to do. In the guise of public health, in the guise of security. Look at counterterrorism; it's all in the guise of protecting people. And in a sense, it's about control. Look at the health industry is as much as it has been beneficial to have precautions at a time of pandemic. There's also very clear indications of the fact that it is being weaponized to control people as well. So you can't just say it's either or, it's somewhere in the middle. But the point is, you can't just go in with your eyes closed. And so I think as Muslims, what we need to do is hold on to the general principles of our religious teachings and the kind of the maxims, the basic principles of what's important: life, health, intellect, wealth, people's honor, lineage. we have to start to protect basic things so that out of the madness that we're in, we create civilization that are worth living in. That's worth living. You want to live in a civilization where you feel that you want to get up in the morning and you want to build something and you want to contribute. Not that you want to get up and just survive and eat.
If you are on syllabus page, or I think there is an issue with today Radio Ramadan's Facebook page. Again, that's something I'm going to talk about. Just let us know where you are. Just write a comment of where you are just now. So this situation of where we are allowed to stream, we believe that we made a poster on a certain situation, a conflict. Well, it's not even worthy of saying conflict, an oppressive situation that exists in the world, and we made several posters and we posted on Facebook, and our Facebook is down. We cannot, whatever we post, there is zero reach. And that's happened to a Facebook page with 3.5 million followers, but zero reach. And they've been informed here in Pakistan, I'm talking about in Lahore, that your reach is going to be zero. So you can only search the page and then go. So people are now misspelling, because it's AI, deliberate misspelled certain names of places, countries, situations, conflicts, Afghanistan, Kashmir, Palestine, blah, blah, blah. And if you're discussing whichever direction you're going into, if you are discussing, say, Taliban, and that, I don't know what this will cause, which page will go down after I've said what I've said. So that's the situation we live in just now. Anyway, people who are on our page, please do comment and let us know where you are watching or viewing or listening to this broadcast. So, Sheikh, this situation of oppression, a Muslim activist, a Muslim mind, what would you do? What should a mind or a person do? We are where we are, and we are how we have got ourselves into. This world is, the communication is on platform which is not in your control.
Yeah, I mean, this last week on Sunday, one of my earliest teachers, Sheikh Abdul Qadir Sufi, passed away. May Allah grant him the highest abode in paradise. So this idea of censorship and reach is interesting, because he had no Facebook page, he had no instruments of mass communication, he had a small group of students. And I think, thinking about his life and the fact that probably not many people know about him, but the impact he had on Islam in the West, in Europe, in UK, in America, and then the articulation of what Islam is in those countries that influence then the Muslim world, I think we're yet to fathom exactly what that meant, because the students that he had, the people he affected, the types of products that came out of his thinking that affected art, that affected culture, that affected scholarship, that affected politics, that affected the narrative of Islam generally, that other people, even if they don't accept what he was saying, but they had to reposition themselves because what he was saying was very, very strong. I think it tells you that you shouldn't be focusing on the fact that your Facebook page is down or they're not letting you speak. It's like, we're in the month of Hajj. Hajj is finished. What did Allah say to the Prophet Ibrahim? أذن وعلينا البلاغ. وأذن في الناس بالحج. The Quran says, announce to people the Hajj. And it said that the Prophet Ibrahim said to Allah, "Oh Allah, how can I announce? To whom do I announce? Because there's nobody here." And Allah says, أذن وعلي البلاغ. Announce it, and we will convey the message. And
Wow.
that message is every single year it just goes out to people, and in their DNA it's mentioned that they go to Hajj. And so one of the things about censorship is we're partly to blame the fact that we have taken on social media and basically said, okay, we can broadcast, but we never realized that what we broadcast will be censored. And when everyone was like, celebrating that Donald Trump can no longer tweet or can no longer, influence people on Facebook, people didn't have the brain cells to realize that that is, a double-edged sword. Even if it was a good thing, and that's debatable anyway, it meant that that could be utilized, and once it's tested, it's basically a private sphere where you can censor whoever you want. And so, is all our activity online, is all our activity just about, is throwing out tweets and, throwing out accusations and making posts and doing videos without any real influence in the society and the community and the street and the town that you live in? Essentially, we have to go back to the fact that you as an individual have to be loved and respected in your family, in your community, in your mosque, in your city, and people in your city and your family and your community listen to what you're saying. And then the whole point is all those people will then live by the principle that you lived by, and they all live by amazing principles that will then ripple out. And so I think, I'm not saying,
But will the speed match the speed of people at the helm of affairs, and this speed of, from one to the next? Other than if I subscribe to this, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we will do it. So you have to just do your part, and the rest will be done by.
Well, the rest
third,
will be
fourth
done. I mean, to be
dimension.
honest, if you die, it's done. I mean, everyone's going to die, and the whole point is it's not the impact. It's the Prophet said, نية العمل نية المرء خير من عمله, or نية المؤمن خير من عمله, that the intention of a believer is stronger than their action, because the whole point is you need to move to do what you were required to do, regardless of whether you did it or not. You have to. Your reward and recording of the angels is based upon your action, and more than that, is based on the intention that moved the action. And once you've done that, you're happy. The believer is so happy because they've done what they needed to do. They don't see if it was successful. They try to help the poor person. They try to speak up against oppression. They try to help the person that was in need. They try to rectify their own selves, even if they fall back into sin 1,000 times. They tried, and that's a win-win situation for a believer. And because you're not telling you're not telling people to oppress other people, that's it's win-win for everybody. And so I think part of it is that Muslims are too focused on the fact that we need to have results.
Okay. Here's a conversation that we had in the car that we were coming back today. So it's about 3 hours in the car. A very thinking, thoughtful person sitting at the back seat, and I was at the front seat with our guy who was helping drive. So I was going through my Facebook feed, and in that feed was Cat Stevens, Use of Islam, and he had posted something just 2 hours ago, and there were 7.5k likes and around 1,200 comments, and the reach would have been in several thousands, several tens of thousands, probably hadn't reached 1 million. And I just said to Amir, who was next to me, I said, Amir, look at this, because he had posted a few pictures of where we were this afternoon, and he said, 111 likes. I said, look at this. This is like 2 hours ago or 3 hours ago, and it's about 7.6k likes. And I said, okay, tell me, what impact has he had in the society? What did he do? So I started talking about what Cat Stevens could have done or may have had an impact on so many lives, which is use of Islam in the society that he moved in the circles he's moved, and how he has been loyal to his faith through the different lives. But you can't help but think, what makes someone like this one individual have such a reach, and then yet there are institutions who do not have a reach? I'm not talking just the Facebook, but through these modern means, there is this measurement that you do kind of have in your mind. What makes this, and what makes Sh Ruzwan not have the reach?
I mean, the whole point of reach doesn't make any difference, to be honest. I mean, it seriously does not make any difference. I mean, if I've traveled so many countries, met so many scholars. I've got over 100 named scholars that I've studied with. I have zero pictures with any of them. Like zero
Uh-huh.
pictures, nothing. Like I've just met numerous ones just in the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks, I have no pictures because it's irrelevant to me that somebody knows that I met somebody or not. It's actually irrelevant to me that somebody knows that I studied with somebody or not, unless it's of importance in terms of verifying a piece of information. What is important is not reach, because if you say it's a question of reach, then you've got people that have proper reach. You've got people that are doing the most obnoxious things that have, you're talking about 7K, that's nothing. That is like non-existent.
Yeah.
And this is why, Ibrahim Kalin is the spokesman for the president of Turkey. He's a musician, he's a PhD in Islamic theology on Ibn Sina. And he had an interview in Turkish where he was talking about the fact that, the person was asking him, did you not like it when you were, do you like it now that you're so famous? Because everyone in Turkey knows him. He's always on TV, he's always talking. And he says, the reality is that existing, he went to a really deep, deep place because he's done his PhD was on Ibn Sina and the idea of existence. He basically said that, things that really exist are not the things that we find. The things that really exist are the things that exist in the eyes of God. And what's
Subhanallah.
that? That it's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that God does not look upon your forms and your wealth, but looks at your hearts and your actions. And what the hadith is saying is not saying people do not look at your actions and your wealth and your bodies. It's saying Allah. So people are irrelevant. Khalas, the Prophet Ibrahim, the father of prophets, nobody knew him. He left his family in the middle of a desert. Nobody knew them. And so, I think, even though we talk about civilization and development and politics and prejudice and justice, the end point is actually about your faith and your good actions in the face of tests that you individually have. And you as a radio presenter, me as a person who studied a bit, the president of a Muslim country who has so much responsibility, everybody has a different way that God will, deal with them, will test them, will actually, azmaish, which is like this kind of testing and put them into tribulations. Everyone will have their own menu for that. And success is you and your menu being dealt with by you in a way that is, optimum and in line with your faith and your tradition and your culture. And that's it, success. And if you add all those together, you get the Islamicate conversation, and the Islamic civilization, because all those people will be buried in graveyards. And you walk through these massive graveyards in Muslim countries, and you'll read the names of the people on the graveyards. And each of those people, inshallah, will be people that are, it's like Ibn Hatim al-Razi says, maybe that they've placed their bags in paradise, centuries before we even see their gravestones. And that's real. I think that's the absolute point. So when you talk about politics, you talk about Western Islamophobic rhetoric of governments, you sometimes lose focus on the fact that, life is much more interesting than that. And victory is an assured victory. It's not as if Muslims are in a situation where they're not sure if they're going to be victorious or not. They're victorious. وَأَنْتُمُ الْأَعْلَوْنَ إِن كُنْتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. Allah said you're uppermost if you're believers. So if you're believers, you're uppermost. Doesn't matter. It doesn't say you're uppermost if you gain power, which is, all these Muslim political organizations like Hizb ut-Tahrir saying we need to get power and all the rest of it. That's success. It's not. It's not success, and it's not the way that you start. You start with good ethics. You start with good manners. You start with good conduct. If by doing that conduct you get power, then that's perfect. If by doing the opposite and slandering and backbiting and sowing corruption and undermining security, you get power, that's not the way that Islam taught us to act.
Yeah. Power to add value, power to be what we need to be, the power that should solve some of the tyranny that exists around the walls of Jerusalem.
Mm.
or any other place. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, Islamicate conversation. Okay, so next week I may not be, depends where I will be, but somewhere interesting, possibly, inshallah. Eventually making my way back to the same city, and we will be bringing you another Islamic conversation next week and the week after. Inshallah, we'll announce where from as soon as I hear what the travel arrangements are. Up until next Thursday, Assalamu alaikum to everyone. Keep us in your du'as. And 7 p.m. Glasgow, London time, 11 Lahore, and 9 Istanbul time, we will be back with another Islamic conversation. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.